scripture reading this morning is in Matthew 26, verses 57 through 68, and then we'll finish up reading chapter 27, verses 1 and verses 2. Beginning in Matthew 57, Matthew 26, verse 57. And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priest, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is these men testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and the coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving of death." Then they spat on his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" And then in chapter 27, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. You may be seated.
We're thankful that you're here today, and if you're visiting with us, you're our honored guest. As Daryl mentioned, we do have a special treat. That is, we have a meal following our time of worship together. So you can't find a better deal anywhere in town. Can't find better food anywhere in Florida. So you might as well plan to stay and eat with us, and we hope that you will after our worship today. I heard about a trip that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle took for vacation to France. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was the man that invented the character Sherlock Holmes. As he was taking this trip, he was returning from Marseille to Paris. He was at the taxi stand there, and the taxi driver pulled up, got out, grabbed his suitcase, threw it in the trunk, and Mr. Doyle got in. And the taxi driver looked and said, "Where to, Mr. Doyle?" Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was astounded. He said, "How do you know me? Have you seen me before, or have we met?" The taxi driver said, "No, sir. I've never seen you before. I did read in the newspaper today that you were vacationing in Marseille. This is the taxi stand for those who are returning from Marseille to Paris." He said, "I also noticed that your skin color indicated you had been on vacation." He said, "I further noticed that you were wearing English clothes, not French. And further, there's an ink spot on your right index finger, which indicates that you're a writer." He said, "Therefore, I deduce that you are Sir Arthur Conan Doyle." Doyle was just amazed. He said, "I have a real-life counterpart to my fictional character, Sherlock Holmes." The taxi driver then said, "Plus, there was one other little detail." He said, "Your name is on your suitcase." Sometimes what appears to be something kind of astounding may be something rather obvious. I want you to think with me this morning, there have been many famous murder trials in history. All right? When we talk about how many murders there may have taken place in the world, in all history, we're talking millions. Okay? First-degree murder is something that's premeditated, planned, done with malice. Trials of murder have become big TV events. You remember O.J. Simpson's murder trial? You remember the glove that he tried on with his hand? The Menendez brothers, the D.C. snipers, Scott Peterson, more recently Casey Anthony. All of these drew huge crowds, people that became very invested in watching to see the developments, to see all the legal proceedings of those particular trials. I want you to think with me today about the most significant trial that ever occurred in all of the history of mankind. The trial of Jesus is more important than any of those other trials. In fact, all of those other trials put together can't even begin to touch the hem of the garment of what Jesus' trial meant. And yet, Jesus' trial was done almost in kangaroo-style fashion. It wasn't done in a way that would be fitting or proper for handling the Son of God. Jesus, as a master teacher, as someone who came with a great understanding of the law of Moses and the traditions or teachings of the rabbis. We have the historical backdrop to be able to look at the Jewish and the Roman trials historically and to be able to kind of hold them up and see if they pass the muster, so to speak, if they meet the identifiable test of jurisprudence, whether Jesus' trial was legal and fair and impartial. One lawyer judge said that there were at least 17 reversible items in Jesus' trial that if it had been appealed to a higher or superior court, it would have been overturned. But of course, everything occurred so hastily that there was no opportunity for Jesus' trial to ever be reviewed or overturned. Think with me about the way in which Jesus' trial, procedurally and from a standpoint of partiality, took place. As we think first about what Mark read there about the Jewish trials, there was the betrayal of Jesus even before the trial. When you think about Judas going out to the Garden of Gethsemane, a familiar place where Jesus would go to pray, and he had left the upper room with the 11 because Judas had separated himself. And we had been prophesied in Psalm 41 and verse 9 that it would be a familiar friend, even one who ate. And of course, Judas had been next to Jesus. Jesus had dipped a morsel into the sop and had handed it to him. That was meant to identify him as the betrayer. Judas was also the one of the group that was the treasurer, according to John 13, about verse 29. He was also a thief that John tells us. Maybe John and the others didn't know it during the lifetime of Jesus, but at least later there, according to John 12 and verse 6, they knew that Judas was a thief. Judas had agreed to, as his wages for betraying Jesus, to 30 pieces of silver, as had been prophesied in Zechariah 11 and verse 12. And so all of these things come together, and we ask ourselves, why? What was Judas's motive? Was it greed? Was it just that he wanted to get some coin in his pocket? I don't think so. Some have conjectured that maybe Judas wanted to hasten Jesus, kind of force his hand to try to take on the Romans and begin the conflict that would allow Jesus to sit on the throne. I don't know what was going on in Judas's mind. What I do know is that after the fact, when Judas saw as things were playing out, and as Jesus was handed over not just from the Jews, but even to the Romans, that Judas came back, and in Matthew 27, verses 3 and 4, he threw down the money and said, I can't take this. He said, I have sinned against innocent blood. So we do know that Judas, in his final evaluation, he recognized that Jesus was just. Jesus was not guilty of anything. Jesus was brought before Annas. Annas was the one who should have been the high priest. The position of high priest, according to the law of Moses, was a lifetime position. But the Romans, in order to kind of weaken the power of the Jews, had taken that authority away from one person and had spread it around. We're told by historians that no less than 6 of Annas' family, sons or sons-in-law, served in the position of high priest even during Annas' life. So Annas being that lifetime high priest, they naturally took him to Annas first, even though Annas didn't have any kind of legal authority. Annas asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus' response is, I taught openly. If you want to know what I taught, ask those who heard me what I said. One of the officers reaches out and brutally slaps or strikes Jesus. And Jesus says, if I've spoken well or spoken the truth, why do you strike me? Understand, Jesus' teaching was out there, and Annas, just like any of the others who would try this case, had ample opportunity to hear him, to understand what it was that Jesus was doing. But Annas, by serving in this position, the Mishnah, which were the compilation of the rabbinic teachings written by the Rabbi Judah in the 2nd century A.D., even though this was after the time of Jesus, the history of those rabbinic traditions had accumulated. So we know that they were also a part of the time period in which Jesus was tried. But the Mishnah had warned, be not sole judge, for there is one who is the sole judge. You know who they were referring to as God himself. And so it was that Annas turned Jesus over to his son-in-law, who was the high priest according to the Romans, Caiaphas. And so Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, that's the supreme court of the Jews. There were 70 members plus the high priest who served on this council. The quorum was only a third. If there were 23 members of the Sanhedrin plus the high priest, this was ample. They gathered at Caiaphas' home. Strike number 1. The hall that they should have met was called Gazeth, the hall of the hewn stone. This is where they were to render their official meetings. The next thing that the trial was done was it was carried out at night. One of the things that the Jewish law called for was that their trials were to be done by the light of day, so that others could witness or sit in or view what was taking place in the proceedings. This was done hurriedly at night. The second thing, or third thing that we see, is that they did this as a capital trial, seeking Jesus' death, and they did it in one day. In fact, Jesus' trial, from the time that he was arrested, taken to Annas, to Caiaphas, and the verdict was given of the whole council, or the Sanhedrin, was probably less than 6 hours. They were supposed to take 2 days because if you're deliberating over somebody's life, you ought to sleep on it. You ought to give it full consideration. Here, Caiaphas also acts as the prosecuting attorney. The high priest wasn't to do that. They bring these witnesses in, and all of the accounts of the gospel tell us that they were false witnesses. That is, they tried to get them to conspire. According to Deuteronomy 17:6, 2 or 3 witnesses were required to establish the truth, and they had to speak as of one voice. The questions that were to be asked, interrogated of those witnesses, was to test to see that they really were talking about the same thing. You may or may not notice that what they say about Jesus as far as destroying the temple isn't exactly what Jesus had said. Jesus had said, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Not, I am able to destroy this temple. No, Jesus' temple, that is, he was speaking of his body, would be destroyed, but it would be destroyed by the very hands of those who were now placing him on trial and seeking false testimony. In Deuteronomy 19, in the passage there talking about witnesses as well, these witnesses were to tell the truth. And every effort was to be made by the council to see and to test that they were actually in full agreement. That wasn't done, as they were trying to get to say anything that they could thereby accuse Jesus. This capital trial was done with all of the efforts to try to convict Jesus. This trial was also held on a special or feast day. It was done on the day of preparation, And this was something that was also prohibited because of the attention, the focus of their worship being to God. So to have the distraction of trying to have a trial during this very holy time was also something that went against their law. I want you to notice, as Mark read for us, look there in verse 63 of Matthew 26. As Jesus kept silent, which had also been prophesied in Isaiah 53, it says, "And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." One of the things that they were not to do was to expect the accused to testify against themselves. That's part of our legal system even today, that we can't force or compel someone to testify against themselves. And the very act that Caiaphas takes here against Jesus is proof positive that the truth, justice, was not what Caiaphas was after. Tell us, are you the Christ? Look at what Jesus says there in verse 64. It is as you said. What Jesus essentially says is, yes, I am. I am the Christ. Of course, Caiaphas gets so upset as he asks this, he tears his clothes. In Leviticus 21:10, the high priest was never to tear his clothes. It's insightful that God would also say to the prophet Joel in Joel 2:13, "Rend your hearts, not your garments." What God wanted was that spiritual desire and seeking and compliance or submission to His will, not the fact that Caiaphas would just make this open show of what he wanted to happen. And then, notice what Caiaphas says there in Matthew 26 and verse 65. He tore his clothes. He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. I want you to notice that what Caiaphas does is he renders the verdict. Guilty. You heard it. Guilty of blasphemy. And then Caiaphas calls for the vote. Notice that the vote, as he says there in verse 66, what do you think? In other words, give me an answer. And they answered and said, he is deserving of death. Here was another procedural error, because each one of the members of the Sanhedrin was to vote individually, not collectively. What Caiaphas did was he wanted to hasten to the conclusion. It was Caiaphas who had said, according to John 11:49-52, that it would be expedient for one man to die and not for the whole nation to perish. They were plotting from that moment to kill Jesus. And so it is that Caiaphas says, here's the verdict. Tell me if you agree. Under these kinds of capital trials, there were to be two secretaries. They sat in a semi-arc, and one of the secretaries sat at one end, keeping the votes for, and the other secretary kept at the other end the votes against. There's no record of any individual votes taken. Not only did they not take 2 days for this capital trial, it was done very speedily, as they all voted together and said he deserved to die. So it is that the Jewish trial ends with this charge of blasphemy. So they bring him to Pilate. Pilate's an interesting historical character, but I just have to tell you, not a very respectable one. Pilate, his father was a native of Seville, Spain. His father was known as a renegade, and Pilate was an opportunist looking for political advantage. He had been given as his wife at one time Claudia, the daughter of Caesar Augustus. But the reason that she was given to Pilate was because they wanted to get her out of Rome. And the reason they wanted to get her out of Rome was because of the debaucheries that she had committed. She was lewd and she was conniving. And so they gave her to Pilate. Does this tell you something about the man? At least 3 times, Josephus tells us that he had major conflicts with the Jews. The Bible records one of those in Luke 13:1, that he had taken the blood of certain Galileans and had mingled that blood with the sacrifices. Now, Pilate wasn't looking to make friends. Pilate usually was at his palace at Caesarea, but during the feast he would come to Jerusalem to help ensure peace. That's why he's here on this occasion. So they bring Jesus to Pilate, and there they accuse him of many things. And I say that because wasn't the charge that he was convicted of blasphemy? There's no mention of blasphemy ever being told to Pilate. Instead, what they say is that he's an evildoer. He's perverting the nation. He's forbidding tribute or taxes to be paid to Caesar. And he said he was Christ, the King. Tiberius, who was the Caesar at this time, was so nervous that he was known to have put to death 52 people for suspicion of treason. If Pilate had thought that Jesus was any kind of a threat, he certainly would have acted. Pilate wanted to get some help, and so he sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, you remember, was the one person that Jesus spoke rather unfavorably about when he said in Luke 13:31, "Go tell that fox." Not a great compliment to Herod Antipas. But here we see as he comes to Herod, Herod is a curiosity seeker. He wants the gratification of seeing a miracle. In other words, here Jesus is, so do something. Amaze me. Be better than a magician. Jesus does nothing and says nothing. Herod finally, in frustration, sends him back to Pilate. As Pilate gets Jesus back, no less than 3 times does he tell the people he is innocent. I find no fault in him. He wants to release him. He tries this, but the crowds begin swelling as the early morning hours are occurring. Pilate's wife has warned him in a dream, according to Matthew 27:19, not to have anything to do with this just man. Pilate tries everything he can to try to release Jesus. He talks with Jesus, and Jesus says, well, my kingdom's not of this world. Pilate's confused. He's not really concerned. And he says, Jesus says, if my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight. And he said, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to bear witness of the truth. At this point, Pilate kind of waxes philosophical, and he says, what is truth? There in John 18:38, excuse me. What we see is that Jesus and Pilate are on 2 different wavelengths. Pilate realizes that it's only for envy that they've delivered him, so he makes one last effort. He says, there's a custom here at the Passover that I release to you one of the prisoners. I'll give you this man, Barabbas, who was a known insurrectionist and murderer, or Jesus. They cry out that they want Barabbas. I mean, Pilate's bewildered. I've tried everything I can. He finally washes his hands when the people say, his blood be on us and on our children. And Pilate turns Jesus over to them. When you look at this, you say, well, how could this happen? Wasn't it just Sunday, the first day of this week, when they had been crying out in the streets, putting their coats in the palm branches and saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord? Yes. And now it is Friday early morning that they are calling for Jesus to be crucified. Why the difference? Jesus had not asserted himself. That is, Jesus had not made strides toward being the earthly king that they wanted. But an expert in mob psychology had this to say: an excited throng easily turns mob because excitement. Excitement weakens the reasoning power and predisposes to the suggestions in line with the master emotion. An agitated gathering is tender or kindling. And throngs that form in time of public tension are very liable to become mobs. How many times have we seen that with riots in various times in history, even in our own nation? That people who become agitated and come together, all of a sudden their emotions rise. Rather than being able to bring reason and to be able to logically calm each other down, instead they go up like a flame. What we see is they cried for Jesus. Crucify him. Crucify him. And so Pilate says, you see to it. And he gives this sentence. And we know this is the sentence because he places it on the sign over Jesus' head. This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. They said, well, why don't you say that he said he was King of the Jews? Pilate said, no. What I've written, I have written. So this is the scene in which the trial of Jesus occurred. A Sunday school teacher was talking to her students, and she was trying to stress to them the importance of the crucifixion. And she said, do you understand this idea of the crucifixion? Do you understand what it means? Do you understand what it means to us and to you? One of the little boys finally said, teacher, Why are you making this so difficult? What it means is God will do almost anything for us. That's what the cross symbolizes. Is that God will do almost anything in order to be able to offer us salvation, to be able to rescue us, to be able to save us from ourselves and from our sins. When I look at the trial of Jesus, I want to ask you a question. What will you do with Jesus? You see, the trial of Jesus was not just then. The trial of Jesus has been continuing. It takes place in time with each one of us. Every single one of us has to decide, what will I do with Jesus? What will you say? Can we look at Jesus and can we say, kind of like the false witnesses, well, he said this or he said that? You know better. Can we do like Pilate and just kind of wash our hands and say, well, I'm innocent. I didn't have anything to do with Jesus' death on the cross. No. Will you just deny him and say, I just don't believe that he is really who he said he was? That's pretty tough. With all the evidence. Will you delay and say, well, I just won't make up my mind. I'll just wait until I actually stand before God and I'll say then, well, I just couldn't decide. You know? I didn't want to just flip a coin, Lord, and so I just kind of waited. I just kind of sat back. You can't just delay. It's just not possible. By the last day of history, we will all stand before God, and on that day, we will all have a verdict. And the verdict that will be given to you then is the verdict that you are making, choosing now. The verdict is, who is Jesus to you? Who do you say that I am? Jesus asked his disciples on one occasion, he said, who do men say that I am? They said, well, some say you're Elijah, some John the Baptist, one of the prophets. And then Jesus turned it, just like it is on us. And he said, but who do you say that I am? Peter, impetuous Peter, always quick with an answer, said, you're the Christ, Son of the living God. Oh, Peter, you got it right. I wish Peter had understood all that entailed, but he did later. Maybe more so than any of us, because Peter was willing to lay down his life. He was willing to die for that which he had been convicted. The question is, what will you do with Jesus? What will you say? Jesus will one day answer for us. And that is, when we stand before him, Jesus said, whoever confesses me before men, him will I confess before my Father. But whoever denies me before men, him will I deny before my Father. Matthew 10, 32 and 33. Oh, confession means to agree and say, God, you're right. I'm lost. Without Jesus, I'm going to die in my sins. I'm going to spend eternity separated from God. I'm going to be in hell because I did not choose Jesus. Jesus. Queen Elizabeth II, every year, makes an address to Parliament. And in this process, she first goes to the House of Commons. She knocks on the door. They open the door. They see the Queen standing there, and they close the door in her face. She then proceeds over to the House of Lords, where she is accepted, and she makes her speech. The Queen of the British Empire can go to 61 different countries, and they call her Queen. But there is one place that she cannot go, called the House of Commons. When you look at Jesus, Jesus is the Lord of heaven and earth. He can come to the earth and he can go anywhere. He's Lord. But there is one place that he will not go unless that place is open to him. In Revelation 3:20, and many people abuse this passage, I want you to listen. This is spoken to the church at Laodicea. These are Christians. And Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock, and whoever will open to me, I will come in and dine with him, and he with me. Even among children of God, if we close the door, we can put Jesus on the outside. If you have never obeyed the gospel, if you've never taken Jesus as your Savior and Lord, it is because you have not accepted the things that Jesus has said, and you've not complied by being obedient to Him. Jesus said, except you believe that I am He, you will die in your sins. John 8:24. Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior of the world. Jesus said, except you repent, you will all likewise perish. Jesus said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. If you've never put on Christ in the waters of baptism, won't you do that today? If you have, and you realize that in your life that there are things that have kept you from honoring Him, that have kept you from confessing Him, that have kept you from living a Christian life, won't you open that door? Won't you obey the gospel? If we can pray with you as a child of God today, for you to rededicate yourself and recommit yourself, we would love to do that. We want to assist you. If you have a response that you need to make to the Lord, because one day the question will be, what will you do with Jesus? Make that decision today. If you need to come, step to the front right now while we stand and while we sing.